Hi class, this is the second video out of possibly 4 now, see how this one goes, on the mold making process. So it has been 4 hours, it's actually been longer, but here is my silicone mold that I poured in the last video. It is completely set up. It is nice, kind of very dense rubber. If you look at the bottom, you can see what I was talking about. This is the footprint, the opening in the mold that you will pour through. This is also the place where you have to get the clay out. So, depending on what you used for this container, you may have to break it, you may have to cut it open. It just depends on how well it goes, but you need to be careful. The rubber will not stick to the plastic. So you can peel it back and try to work it around so that you release the vacuum created by the silicone. If you can do that, you might be able to save your container. And I'm not going to try too hard because this container cost 50 cents, and I actually will be able to use it as a mother mold. Oh, but I think I'm going to be able to get it out. Yes, I am. So I just stretched it this way, and it released it. It allowed air to get in underneath it, and there's the mold. Exact same shape as this. So keep this. You may need it. It depends on the situation here. And how big of a hole do you have, and what is the shape of your form stuck inside, right? The clay. Well, if you remember, mine was kind of a diamond shape or a gem, but if I can pull, and I can pull, away from the clay, you can see that the clay does not stick to the silicone. And in that way, it is a really great pairing of materials to execute this process. Now, I'm feeling around. I didn't mark it on the container that I cast in, but I know I had one axis that was longer than the other. So I am going to have to cut my mold to get the clay out. So I'm feeling around and finding the more dense area. It's softer in this direction, but if I come around here, I find this is much harder when I squeeze in like this on this axis. So I know that this is the wide part. What I'm going to do, even if you're doing this at home, you should do this, just as a reference, so you'll know where to cut. Something like that. Okay? This is a Sharpie. It'll totally rub off. It doesn't really matter. As long as you know where that trajectory is, you'll be able to cut the mold. A ballpoint pen works really well too. But the way you want to cut the mold, you don't saw back and forth. Do not. You want to, and I'm going to try to do this in a way that you can see what I'm doing. So, I'm not going to the edge. I'm coming in about 1/2 inch. I'm going to push all the way in and then just come back to the clay. And if I cut the clay up, that doesn't matter. So now you can see I can pull that open more. Come over here and do the same thing on the other side. You know, if you saw back and forth, you run the risk of removing some of the silicone, and you don't want to do that. If you remove the silicone, you are creating a space inside your piece that should not be there because it's not a part of your cast form. I'm going to have to cut more, so I'm going to cut here, here, and here. And yes, you're cutting towards yourself, but the silicone is very tough. Just make sure you don't slip. So if it skips out like that and you have your hand back here, you can cut yourself. So I've cut it in 4 directions, well, this way and this way, 2 axes. And now I can really pull it open and likely get the clay out. The silicone is really resilient. I can pull on it and push it until the clay comes out. And there's the clay. Because I use the hard clay and my piece is relatively simple, there's not a lot of ornate detail or anything, all of the clay came out. It is possible that some of you may have to cut these open a little bit more so that you can get everything out. I am going to cut mine, for example, so that you guys will know what to do. You don't have to cut them completely in half. Some of you may have to, but I'm going to say that you probably won't. I'm going to extend these cuts down to the side. Again, trying to do this in a way that you can see. You may need another person to hold it open while you cut. But again, we're not sawing. We're letting the blade do the work. Now I've cut it down the side here. And this will actually aid in the demolding of the resin, because I'll be able to pull the silicone apart a little more and release the piece. So now I've opened it up that much, right? And you can see it is coming down the side. So if you end up having to cut down the side like this, you need to get some rubber bands. And really, it doesn't have to be super tight. You don't want to deform it so that it's pushing in so much that it deforms the interior space, but just enough to hold it. Let's see what happens if I double this. All right, doubling that is too much. So I'm going to choose a different rubber band, one that's a little thicker, and just put it around at one time, and that is plenty. Resin will not leak out. In fact, so what's happening up here, this silicone is so thin that it's kind of pushing into the form, into the cavity inside, and I don't want that. So I'm going to carefully take my scissors and cut away this thin area, just so I don't have any silicone dipping down into the resin when I cast it. Make sure none of that drips down inside or fell into the mold. It will get trapped inside of your resin. A little bit more. And I didn't take off a lot, right? So you may find that when things come back together, they are misregistered, right? You just want to make sure that everything, all of these seams end up in the spot that they should be. Don't let them misregister, because then you will have a mold line on your cast piece and you'll have to sand that out or cast another one so you get a good one. Take your time. Okay, this mold is ready to go. Actually, all I'm doing is blowing a little bit, making sure that none of that silicone got trapped inside. Okay, if I scoot back a little more, you can see, good. Moving all of this out of the way. Now, I don't need one for this mold, but I am going to show you how to make a mother mold with this situation. I'm going to take this off first, place this back in the original cup and let it settle in. Doesn't have to be perfect, but it helps if it gets back in there correctly. Not quite down all the way. So I'm going to draw a line at the top of the silicone. Actually, there's a line already implied with the step of the plastic from here to here. So if you're looking from here to here, I'm going to cut it along here. Okay? So around this ridge. So I marked that, right, under here. And on the bottom, I'm going to mark where the hole is, because I need to cut that out as well. So I'm going to get the mold back out. To cut this, it's going to be easier to grab some scissors. And if you had to destroy your cup as you pulled it out of the mold, that's okay. You should have 2 cups that are the same size if you need a mother mold. This is what happens. You'll need something like this if you end up having to cut your mold completely in half. You can do this if you cast into a paper cup or any plastic container. Just a word of warning, if you do use paper cups, you need to make sure that they're lined with plastic. Do not use styrofoam. The silicone may stick to the paper, and then you have to work the paper off in the sink. You have to work out the silicone as well as the plastic. And the wax on most paper cups is a good separator, so it won't stick. Now I'm going to cut that out with the X-Acto blade. Doesn't have to be perfect. This is just so you have a good pour cup to work from. Now, if I put this, say it's in 2 pieces, but I put them back together and drop it back in the mother mold keeps everything registering correctly. And now I have a hole in the bottom where I can pour into. What you also need to do with a situation like this is trace it on a piece of cardboard. So you have a circle that's exactly the circumference of this. And then cut it out with your blade, your X-Acto blade, or your scissors. In cardboard, I prefer an X-Acto blade. Scissors in cardboard, I don't know, they don't work well together. It doesn't have to be a perfect cut. This is really just about support. Slightly dull blade, it's an old one, so this doesn't need to be precise. I'm not worried about the condition of my blade too much. There we go. Now, we'll take this, place it here, grab some tape, and I'm going to grab some tape. I think tape, it can be blue tape, doesn't have to be any specific kind of tape. I do think, Scotch tape is not going to be strong enough, but you can pull a couple of lengths and just tape it down to the side of the plastic. And now you have not pressure pushing, but enough pressure so that the interior of the mold does not deform, especially if you have a 2 or 3 piece mold. Okay, you can do this again with a paper cup or any other mold or cup that to make your mold with. If you do it with a unique box, that's going to be a slightly different story. So we probably won't do that. Now, because I don't need this mother mold, I showed you how to make it, but I don't need it to cast my piece. I'm going to go ahead and remove it. And you can use this over and over and over again with this setup. This mold will last a really long time. So you can cast 40 of whatever you want as long as you have material to cast in here. By the way, this silicone is not food safe. You can cast wax into it. You can cast, you could cast chocolate into it, but don't eat whatever you cast into it. Okay, just a word of warning. They do make food safe silicone, so if you want to engage in that, talk to the guys at Reynolds and they can guide you well. So there we are. I'm going to pop this off because I don't need it. And, you know, the key with this process is patience. A lot of what you're doing is process and not really making. You're not being creative necessarily at this stage. When you're sculpting this, that's where the creativity is. That's where your skill comes in. This is just about executing a process as accurately as you can. Everything looks good. So, bring in the Smoothcast 300 over. We've got part B, I think. That's part B. And part A. You have the same situation. You have compliance paperwork and literature. You don't really need to read that, but they by law have to put it on every box. Here's the same thing that I showed you with silicone, but for the resin. The important thing here is the same table, and you guys should look over it. Hot Life. Smoothcast 300 is the one, it's the second one down. That's 3 minutes. That means once part A hits part B, it has to be poured within 3 minutes. Your cure time is 10 minutes. So you should be able to demold in 10 minutes. The rest of this is, again, for manufacturing purposes and things like that, for engineers. We don't need to know that, but you should look over it. Also, these products are not toxic as long as you are using them in a large open space. If you are using them in a closet, then you should wear a respirator. The reason why these things are not toxic in the States is because our spaces are so big. The chemical that used to make these things super toxic is cyanoacrylate. It's the same thing that's in super glue. And they have taken that chemical down to 0.01% of what it used to be. So it is extremely user-friendly. And, you know, it says stir well before using. So same thing. This stuff is much more viscous than the silicone. And this resin is white. So you know. At this point, I should put on my gloves. I'm getting ready to get the liquid out and start playing with chemicals. Sometimes, again, it is difficult to get the foil off, so I'll start it with my X-Acto blade. And I try to get all of it off. You can take it, it can stay on the rim if it doesn't peel off easily, but if you have any of the loose stuff left over, it can surprise you and make it pour in a way you're not expecting. So we want to try to get as much of that off as possible. There. Okay, part A, I'm just going to close it back up. It is open now, it is shaken, does not need to be stirred. And then part B, same thing here, starting it with the X-Acto blade and peeling it back. Now, similarly to the silicone, this is 1-to-1 by volume, and because the stuff is much more fluid, it's a little bit more difficult to pour accurately. The Smooth On company has not figured out how to engineer this part, and so when you pour it, it's sometimes slightly unruly. Now, you need at least 2 cups. Actually, you need 3. You need a mixing container to mix the resin in, and you need 2 cups to measure it, part A and part B. How do you know how much to measure? Well, you take your clay and you go, well, all right, I put that in there. If I look at this and I compare the volumes, they're close to the same. So I'm going to err on the side of excess and I'm going to measure. Let's see, it says, I'm going to do, let's see, 50 milliliters. That's a little bit more than halfway, right? Because these are 80 milliliter cups. So if I do 50 milliliters of part A and 50 of part B, I should have mixed more than enough to fill the mold. Now, just in case I don't mix enough, I'm not going to confuse my cups, okay? So I have part B, and looking at the measurements on the side, I'm going to fill it up to 50 milliliters. It's kind of hard to see because it's super clear. So go slow. There we go. Same thing for part A. Part A is a little bit yellow, so it's easier to see as you're filling up the cup. If you use clear cups, it's really easy to see what's going on. But a lot of clear cups don't have markings on them. So if you eyeball it, so say you have, I bought some of these as examples also. Say you have cups like this, party cups, right? These work well also, right? Because you can see everything, but it's sometimes difficult to discern for some people an equal measurement in one versus another. But always have them set up side by side so you can compare. If you mismix and you have one side way more than another, or even slightly more, it may not set up. So if that happens, don't panic. You're going to have to get the plastic out of your mold and then clean it with rubbing alcohol. Again, do not clean it with soap and water. It must be cleaned with rubbing alcohol. Okay, so I got my stir stick. I have my container. I have my part A and part B. I'm going to pour them both in. Let them drip, same amount of time so you get equal amounts in there. I'm sitting them next to the cups they came from. And then I'm stirring. 3 minutes is plenty of time to stir and mix this well. You can't see what I'm doing. Let's scoot this back some. I'm not stirring vigorously. I can tell when they're mixed. It actually becomes more clear. You're not trying to whip it. You don't want to add air bubbles. It's well mixed at this point. I'm going to let the excess drip off the stir stick. You can see it mixed in there. And it's clear at this point, but when it sets up, it's white. Set the stir stick aside, and I'm going to pour my mold. Say, for instance, you are not good at figuring out how much to mix. Well, if you don't mix enough, that's okay. You can do the same thing with the resin that you could do with the silicone and pour right back on top. Okay, it is full. I have a little bit left in the container. I'm going to pick this up and show it to you real quick. So you can see the container still has some in it, and the mold is full. Those air bubbles on top will pop, but what you can also do if you see air bubbles, and it's just good practice, is to tap it a little bit. Sorry, you can't see that. Let's see. Tap the mold a little bit, similar to how I showed you to tap the plaster, so that any air bubbles that are trapped inside may come up. All right, that is demo number 2 for the casting project. This is the longest one. The next one will be about demolding this. All right, should not take quite as long.